Good evening. We begin tonight with breaking news from the Middle East. Israel has been struck by a second large-scale terrorist attack, eerily reminiscent of the events of October 7, 2023. This new assault, planned and carried out by Hamas and other militant factions, targeted multiple locations across southern Israel in a coordinated offensive. But what is perhaps most alarming is the emerging evidence that many of the attackers were individuals released from Israeli prisons earlier this year as part of a controversial ceasefire deal. In total, Israeli officials report at least 200 dead, hundreds more injured, and several civilians taken hostage once again. The Israeli military has responded with immediate and intense airstrikes, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has declared that Israel is now in a state of war. As the conflict intensifies in the Middle East, the political and social fallout is spreading worldwide. In major cities across the United States and Europe, mass protests have erupted. On university campuses, student activists, many already radicalized by months of anti-Israel and anti-Western rhetoric, have mobilized en masse, with demonstrations quickly turning into clashes with police and counter-protesters. Here in the United States, protests at Columbia University, UC Berkeley, and Harvard have drawn thousands, with slogans such as Global Intifada now and Death to Israel echoing through the streets. Some demonstrators are seen waving Palestinian and even Hezbollah flags, while others openly justify the attack as resistance against oppression. Meanwhile, Jewish students and faculty report feeling increasingly unsafe, with some institutions advising them to avoid public spaces on campus. In Washington, the Trump administration is facing intense scrutiny. With confirmation that released prisoners played a direct role in the attack, critics argue that U.S. foreign policy has catastrophically failed. The president, who earlier this year negotiated the ceasefire deal that facilitated the prisoner release, addressed the nation today, calling the attack unforgivable and reaffirming U.S. support for Israel. But his remarks have done little to quell backlash from both sides of the aisle. Both Republicans and Democrats are calling for a full investigation into how the administration handled the deal, with some even pushing for military action. Meanwhile, progressive lawmakers and activists, many of whom have long been vocal in their criticism of Israel, are now demanding that the U.S. halt military aid entirely, even as Israeli civilians endure renewed violence. As the world watches, intelligence agencies are now warning that this moment could mark a major turning point, not just for Israel and the Middle East, but for Western democracies facing rising extremism within their own borders. Federal authorities are closely monitoring reports that foreign-backed groups may be using the current protests as an opportunity to fuel greater unrest in the U.S. and Europe. Meanwhile, in Israel, the situation is rapidly evolving. The Israeli Defense Forces have announced the launch of a full-scale military operation in Gaza, with reports of ground forces mobilizing. As we speak, airstrikes continue to pound suspected militant targets, and tensions are reaching a boiling point. The coming days will be critical. Will Israel's response be enough to prevent future attacks? How will global leaders react? And will the unrest spreading across the West continue to escalate? This is an ongoing story, and we will keep you updated as new developments emerge. For now, I'm Rachel Matthews, and this has been your breaking news report. Stay with us as we continue our coverage. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We begin tonight with breaking developments in a rapidly escalating online campaign that national security experts are now calling a dangerous shift in extremist tactics. In what officials are describing as a coordinated effort, an extensive network of pro-Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iranian-linked accounts have launched a social media blitz across multiple platforms, urging followers to move beyond protest demonstrations and take direct action against what they call Zionist and imperialist institutions in the United States. The campaign, which surfaced in early November, has spread across Telegram, TikTok, and X, formerly known as Twitter, where anonymous accounts, often using AI-generated avatars, have posted incendiary messages calling for resistance in the form of lone wolf attacks, sabotage, and coordinated acts of disruption against key American infrastructure. Intelligence analysts say this marks a troubling evolution from prior social media campaigns that primarily focused on rallying protests and influencing public discourse. This time, the rhetoric is different. Explicit calls for violence are circulating in encrypted messaging groups and spilling into mainstream social platforms, often cloaked in vague slogans or coded language. Law enforcement officials are particularly concerned about the way these messages are being amplified. While the origin of the campaign appears to be linked to radical elements in Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran, the narratives are being repackaged and distributed by Western-based activists, some of whom may not fully grasp the real-world implications of the rhetoric they're sharing. Some messages openly celebrate recent attacks against Israeli and U.S. interests abroad, while others instruct followers on how to carry out acts of vandalism, cyber attacks, and even arson, directing them toward symbolic targets such as government buildings, corporate headquarters, and Jewish community centers. This escalation has drawn sharp warnings from U.S. intelligence officials, who say the potential for real-world violence is growing. The FBI and Department of Homeland Security have issued internal alerts to law enforcement agencies nationwide, warning of an increased risk of domestic terrorism inspired by the online incitement. A senior DHS official, speaking on background, told us that investigators are monitoring an uptick in encrypted conversations discussing potential targets and tactics, raising fears that at least some individuals are heeding these calls to action. The White House has also weighed in on the developments. A National Security Council spokesperson released a statement earlier today condemning what they called an organized attempt to incite violence and sow chaos within the United States. The statement affirmed that federal agencies are working with social media platforms to curb the spread of violent extremist content and are prepared to take action against individuals found to be engaging in illegal activity. Meanwhile, social media companies are once again under scrutiny for their handling of extremist content. Despite past efforts to combat terror-related propaganda, platforms like X and TikTok have been slow to remove many of the posts in question, leading to growing criticism from lawmakers and security experts. At the center of the controversy is Telegram, a platform long favored by extremist groups due to its encrypted messaging capabilities and lax content moderation policies. Experts say that Telegram channels affiliated with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iranian-backed militias have been instrumental in spreading and coordinating these calls to action. Many of these channels have seen a surge in followers in recent weeks, with propaganda videos, instructional manuals, and direct incitements to violence being posted in rapid succession. The use of memes and viral trends to target younger audiences is also a growing concern, as analysts warn that radical elements are increasingly using the language of social justice and anti-imperialism to recruit disaffected individuals. As authorities work to counter the threat, Jewish and pro-Israel organizations across the country are urging increased vigilance. Several synagogues and community centers have already enhanced their security protocols, with some calling on local police for additional protection. The broader geopolitical implications of this campaign cannot be ignored either. With tensions in the Middle East at a boiling point, experts believe that Iran and its proxies are using social media as part of a wider strategy to destabilize Western nations and erode public support for U.S. allies. Iranian state-affiliated media outlets have also been pushing narratives that frame these online efforts as part of a global resistance movement, further legitimizing the rhetoric for those susceptible to radicalization. For now, the question remains, how far will this online campaign go? Officials warn that as long as extremist propaganda continues to spread unchecked, the risk of violence on American soil will remain high. Law enforcement agencies are urging the public to report any suspicious online activity and to remain aware of potential threats in their communities. This is a developing story, and we will continue to bring you updates as they unfold. Stay with us for the latest developments on this growing security concern. Good evening, I'm Rachel Matthews, and we begin tonight with a developing story out of New York City, where a Jewish community center was the target of a deadly terrorist attack earlier today. The attack, which law enforcement is calling a coordinated assault, unfolded just after 11 a.m. Eastern Time, when multiple armed assailants stormed the facility, opening fire on staff and civilians inside. The attack, horrifying in its execution, was live-streamed by the attackers themselves, echoing past incidents of extremist violence. According to authorities, the assailants, believed to have been inspired by ISIS and Palestinian militant groups, had planned the attack for weeks, releasing online manifestos prior to the assault. These documents referenced the so-called Global Intifada, a term used by extremist factions to justify acts of terror against Jewish and Western targets. The attackers explicitly blamed the United States for what they called Zionist crimes, drawing connections to ongoing tensions in the Middle East. Eyewitnesses describe a chaotic scene as the heavily armed individuals stormed the building, firing indiscriminately. "I heard gunshots, screaming, people running. It was absolute terror," one survivor told reporters. Within minutes, a massive law enforcement response was underway. NYPD counterterrorism units, along with federal agencies, swiftly engaged the suspects in a high-stakes standoff. By early afternoon, all attackers had been neutralized, though not before lives were lost. Officials have not yet released a confirmed death toll, but sources indicate multiple casualties, including innocent civilians and possibly law enforcement officers. Authorities are now investigating potential links between the attackers and foreign terrorist organizations, as well as whether they had local support. Security officials are also on high alert, monitoring for potential copycat attacks. Meanwhile, Jewish communities nationwide are reinforcing security measures, fearing that today's assault could signal the beginning of a larger wave of extremist violence. President Trump has condemned the attack in the strongest terms, vowing to bring to justice anyone who had a hand in this horrific act of terror. Speaking from the White House, the president reaffirmed the administration's commitment to protecting all American communities from extremism. Tonight, as New York grieves, there are growing calls for increased counterterrorism measures, particularly to address radicalization efforts occurring online. Law enforcement is urging the public to remain vigilant and report any suspicious activity. We will continue to bring you updates as more details emerge. Stay with American News Outreach for the latest developments on this tragic and deeply unsettling event. Back to you. Good evening. We begin tonight with breaking news across multiple American cities, where what began as mass demonstrations in solidarity with the so-called Global Intifada has escalated into outright violence. Radicalized factions, including elements of Antifa, remnants of the Black Lives Matter movement, and Islamic extremist groups, have coalesced under this Intifada banner, launching attacks against Jewish institutions, Israeli-owned businesses, and police precincts. Authorities are struggling to contain the growing unrest, and federal agencies are now considering an emergency response. What you're seeing here is live footage from downtown Los Angeles, where multiple fires have been set, and police report that synagogues and businesses with ties to Israel have been targeted by rioters. Witnesses say masked individuals carrying Palestinian flags and banners calling for resistance began looting before setting buildings ablaze. This scene played out earlier today in Chicago, where a mob stormed a Jewish-owned grocery store, vandalizing the shelves and assaulting employees. Videos circulating on social media show participants chanting anti-Zionist slogans, with some voices heard calling for Intifada, a term historically linked to violent uprisings against Israel. Law enforcement confirms that these attacks appear to be coordinated through encrypted messaging platforms like Telegram and Signal. In New York, a group identifying itself as the Intifada Defense Collective has issued a statement claiming responsibility for a series of firebombings against synagogues and police stations. The group, which appears to be a loose alliance of left-wing anarchists and radicalized Islamist factions, says their mission is to dismantle Zionist and imperialist control within the U.S. FBI officials are now investigating potential foreign connections, with growing concerns that funding and tactical support may be coming from organizations tied to Hamas, Hezbollah, or even Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. As seen here in footage from Philadelphia, a police precinct was firebombed late last night, with officers forced to evacuate under heavy assault. This follows a wave of attacks on law enforcement over the past week, with radical factions labeling American police as enforcers of Zionist oppression. Federal authorities are now mobilizing counterterrorism units to track key figures behind these violent cells. Meanwhile, Jewish communities across the country are calling for increased security measures, fearing that synagogues and community centers will remain prime targets.
We are living in fear. Our businesses, our places of worship, our very homes are under attack. We never thought we would see this kind of hatred reach American streets at this scale, but here we are. We need protection, and we need it now.
The people have had enough. This is our resistance. The Intifada isn't just for Palestine, it's for every oppressed people fighting against the Zionist empire. We will not stop until the oppressors fall.
These words, and the escalating violence, have drawn sharp responses from state and federal officials. The National Guard has already been deployed in at least 3 major cities, and there are growing calls for domestic counterinsurgency measures to dismantle these radicalized networks before the violence spirals further out of control. We will continue to monitor this situation closely and bring you updates as they come in. Stay safe and stay informed.